Infanteria, to je láska má.
I just wanted to step in and do sort of a group introduction to our next group of readers. We'll have Zdeněk in a moment. And so to resume, indeed, beginning chapter 7 will be Zdeněk Maryška, a distinguished actor from Prague. Continuing chapter 7 will be Debra, a New York City actor. Then moving on to chapter 8, we will have Karel Heřmánek Jr., a Prague actor, followed by our own Hořejš, actor and puppeteer from New York. We'll continue into the second half of chapter 8 with Ronald Prokeš, a bicontinental actor and musician currently in Prague. And we'll continue with Richard Fidler, an actor and broadcaster coming from Sydney, Australia, where it is already April 30th, which is in fact Hašek's birthday. So that's the lineup we've got coming up. And so I will now pass the stage over to Zdeněk Maryška.
Švejk goes to the war. At the time when the forests on the River Rap in Galicia saw the Austrian armies fleeing across the river, and when down in Serbia, one after the other of the Austrian divisions were taken with their pants down and got the walloping they had long deserved, the Austrian Ministry of War suddenly remembered Švejk. Why? Even he might help to get the monarchy out of the mess. When they brought Švejk the order to report within a week for a medical examination on Střelecký ostrov, he happened to be lying in bed, stricken once more by rheumatism. Mrs. Miller was making coffee for him in the kitchen. Mrs. Miller, Švejk called softly from his room. Mrs. Miller, come here for a moment. When the charwoman stood by his bed, Švejk repeated in the same soft voice, sit down, Mrs. Miller. There was something mysterious and solemn in his voice. When she had sat down, Švejk drew himself up in bed and announced, I am going to the war. Holy Mother, shrieked Mrs. Miller. Whatever are you going to do there? Fight, answered Švejk in sepulchral tones. Things are going very badly for Austria. Up above, they are already creeping on us at Krakow, and down below on Hungary. They are crushing us like a steamroller on all sides, and that's why they're calling me up. I read you yesterday from the newspaper, didn't I? That the dark clouds were enveloping our dear fatherland. But you cannot move. That doesn't matter, Mrs. Miller. I shall go to the war in a bath chair. You know that confectioner around the corner? Well, he has just the right kind of bath chair. Years ago, he used to push his lame and wicked old grandfather about in it in the fresh air. Mrs. Miller, you are going to push me to the war in that bath chair. Mrs. Miller burst into tears. Oh, dear sir, shouldn't I run for the doctor? You will not run anywhere, Mrs. Miller. Except for my legs, I'm completely sound cannon fodder. And at the time when things are going badly for Austria, every cripple must be at his post. Just go on making the coffee. And while Mrs. Miller, tear-stained and distraught, poured the coffee through the stainer, the good soldier Švejk started singing in bed. General Windischgrätz, as the cock did crow, unfurled his banner and charged the foe. Rataplan, rataplan, rataplan. Charged the foe and brandished his sword, calling to Mary, Mother of the Lord. Rataplan, rataplan, rataplan. The panic-stricken Mrs. Miller, under the impact of this awe-inspiring war song, forgot about the coffee and, trembling in every limb, listened in horror as the good soldier Švejk continued to sing in bed. With Mary, Mother, and bridges 4, Piedmont, strengthen your posts for war. Rataplan, rataplan, rataplan. At Solferino there was battle and slaughter, piles of corpses and blood like water. Rataplan, rataplan, rataplan. Arms and legs flying in the air, for the brave 18th were fighting there. Rataplan, rataplan, rataplan. Boys of the 18th, don't lose heart. There is money behind in the baggage cart. Rataplan, rataplan, rataplan. For God's sake, sir, please, came the piteous voice from the kitchen. But Švejk was already ending his war song. Money in the cart and wenches in the van. What a life for a military man. Rataplan, rataplan, rataplan. Mrs. Miller burst out of the door and rushed for the doctor. She returned in an hour's time, while Švejk had slumbered off. And so he was woken up by a corpulent gentleman who laid his hand on his forehead for a moment and said, "Don't be afraid. I am Dr. Pavek from Vinohrady. Let me feel your pulse. Put this thermometer under your armpit. Good. Now show me your tongue. A bit more. Keep it out. What did your father and mother die of?" And so at a time when it was Vienna's earnest desire that all the peoples of Austria-Hungary should offer the finest examples of loyalty and devotion, Dr. Pavek prescribed Švejk bromide against his patriotic enthusiasm and recommended the brave and good soldier not to think about the war. Lie straight and keep quiet. I'll come again tomorrow. When he came the next day, he asked Mrs. Miller in the kitchen how the patient was. "He's worse, doctor," she answered with genuine grief. In the night he was singing, if you will pardon the expression, the Austrian national anthem, when the rheumatism suddenly took him. Dr. Pavek felt obliged to react to this new manifestation of loyalty on the part of his patient by prescribing a larger dose of bromide. The third day, Mrs. Miller informed him that Švejk had got even worse. In the afternoon, he sent for a map of the battlefield. "Doctor," and in the night, he was seized by a mad hallucination that Austria was going to win. And he takes his powders strictly according to the prescription. "Oh no, doctor, he hasn't even sent for them yet." Dr. Pavek went away after having called down a storm of reproaches on Švejk's head and assured him that he would never again come to cure anybody who refused his professional help and bromide. Only 2 days remained before Švejk would have to appear before the call-up board. During this time, Švejk made the necessary preparations. First, he sent Mrs. Miller to buy an army cab, and the next he sent her to borrow the bath chair from the confectioner around the corner, that same one in which the confectioner once used to wheel about in the fresh air his lame and wicked old grandfather. Then he remembered he needed crutches. Fortunately, the confectioner still kept the crutches too, as a family relic of his old grandfather. Now he only needed the recruit's bunch of flowers for his buttonhole. Mrs. Miller got these for him too. During these last 2 days, she got noticeably thinner and wept from morning to night. And now I pass the mic to Debra in New York City.
And so on that memorable day, there appeared on the Prague streets a moving example of loyalty. An old woman pushing before her a bath chair in which there sat a man in an army cap with a finely polished imperial badge and waving his crutches. And in his buttonhole there shone the gay flowers of a recruit. And this man, waving his crutches again and again, shouted out to the streets of Prague, "To Belgrade, to Belgrade." He was followed by a crowd of people which steadily grew from the small group that had gathered in front of the house from which he had gone out to war. Švejk could see the policemen standing at some of the crossroads saluted him. At Wenceslas Square, the crowd around Švejk's bath chair had grown by several hundreds. And at the corner of Krivkovska Street, they beat up a student in a German cap who had shouted out to Švejk, "Heil, nieder mit den Serben." At the corner of Vodičkova Street, mounted police rode in and dispersed the crowd. When Švejk showed the district police inspector that he had it in black and white that he must that day appear before the call-up board, the latter was a trifle disappointed. And in order to reduce disturbances to a minimum, he had Švejk and his bath chair escorted by 2 mounted police all the way to the Strelecký Ostrov. The following article about this episode appeared in the Prague official news. A cripple's patriotism. Yesterday afternoon, the passers-by in the main streets of Prague were witnesses of a scene which was an eloquent testimony to the fact that in these great and solemn hours, the sons of our nation can furnish the finest examples of loyalty and devotion to the throne of the aged monarch. We might well have been back in times of ancient Greeks and Romans when Mucius Scaevola had himself led off to battle, regardless of his burnt arm. The most sacred feelings and sympathies were nobly demonstrated yesterday by a cripple on crutches who was pushed in an invalid chair by his aged mother. This son of the Czech people, spontaneously and regardless of his infirmity, had himself driven off to war to sacrifice his life and possessions for his emperor. And if his call to Belgrade found such a lively echo on the streets of Prague, it only goes to prove what model examples of love for the fatherland and the imperial house are preferred by the people of Prague. The Prager Tagblatt wrote in the same strain, ending its article by saying that the cripple volunteer was escorted by a crowd of Germans who protected him with their bodies from lynching by the Czech agents of the Entente. Bohemian published the same report and urged that the patriotic cripple should be fittingly rewarded. It announced that at its offices it was ready to receive gifts from German citizens for the unknown hero. If in the eyes of these 3 journals, the Czech lands could not have produced a nobler citizen, this was not the opinion of the gentleman at the call-up board, certainly not of the chief army doctor Bauza, an utterly ruthless man who saw in everything a criminal attempt to evade military service, the front, bullets, and shrapnel. This German's stock remark was widely famous. The whole Czech people are nothing but a pack of malingerers. During the 10 weeks of his activities of 11,000 civilians, he cleaned out 10,999 malingerers. And he would certainly have got the 11,000th by the throat if it had not happened that just when he shouted, "About turn," the unfortunate man was carried off by a stroke. "Take away that malingerer," said Bauza, when he had ascertained that the man was dead. And on that memorable day, it was Švejk who stood before him. Like the others, he was stark naked and chastely hid his nudity behind the crutches on which he supported himself. "That's really a remarkable fig leaf," said Bauza in German. "There were no fig leaves like that in paradise." "Certified as totally unfit for service on grounds of idiocy," observed the sergeant major, looking at the official documents. "And what else is wrong with you?" asked Bauza. "Humbly report, sir, I'm a rheumatic, but I will serve his imperial majesty to my last drop of blood," said Švejk modestly. "I have swollen knees." Bautz gave the good soldier Švejk a blood-curdling look and roared out in German, "You're a malingerer." Turning to the sergeant major, he said with icy calm, "Clap the bastard into jail at once." 2 soldiers with bayonets took Švejk off to the garrison jail. Švejk walked on his crutches and observed with horror that his rheumatism was beginning to disappear. Mrs. Müller was still waiting for Švejk with the bath chair above on the bridge, but when she saw him under bayoneted escort, she burst into tears and ran away from the bath chair, never to return to it again. And the good soldier Švejk walked along unassumingly under the escort of the armed protectors of the state. Their bayonets shone in the light of the sun, and at Malastrana, before the monument of Radetzky, Švejk turned to the crowd which had followed them and called out, "To Belgrade, to Belgrade!" And Marshal Radetzky looked dreamily down from his monument at the good soldier Švejk, as limping on his old crutches, he slowly disappeared into the distance with his recruit's flowers in his buttonhole. Meanwhile, a solemn-looking gentleman informed the crowd around that it was a dissenter they were leading off. And reading next is Karel Heřmánek Jr.
Švejk, the malingerer. In these great times, the army doctors took unusual pains to drive the devil of sabotage out of the malingerers and restore them to the bosom of the army. Various degrees of torture had been introduced for malingerers and suspected malingerers, such as consumptives, rheumatics, people with hernia, kidney disease, typhus, diabetes, pneumonia, and other illnesses. The tortures to which the malingerers were subjected were systematized, and the grades were as follows. 1. Strict diet, a cup of tea each morning and evening for 3 days, during which, irrespective, of course, of their complaints, aspirin to be given to induce sweating. 2. To ensure they did not think that war was all beer and skittles, quinine in powder to be served in generous portions, or so-called quinine licking. 3. The stomach to be pumped out twice a day with a liter of warm water. 4. Enemas with soapy water and glycerin to be applied. 5. Wrapping up in a sheet soaked in cold water. There were stalwart men who endured all 5 degrees of torture and let themselves be carried off to the military cemetery in a simple coffin. But there were also pusillanimous souls who, when they reached the stage of the enema, declared that they were now well and desired nothing better than to march off to the trenches with the next March battalion. In the garrison prison, Švejk was put into the sanatorium hut among pusillanimous malingerers of this very type. "I can't stand it any longer," said his neighbor in the next bed, who was brought in from the consulting room after having his stomach pumped for the 2nd time. This man was showing short-sightedness. "Tomorrow I'll join the regiment," decided his other neighbor on the left, who had just an enema and who had been shimming deafness. In the bed by the door, a consumptive who was wrapped up in a cold wet sheet was slowly dying. "That's the 3rd this week," observed his neighbor on the right. "And what's your trouble?" "I got rheumatism," answered Švejk. upon which there was a hearty guffaw all around. Even the dying consumptive, who was shemming tuberculosis, joined in the laughter. "Don't try and climb in here with rheumatism," a fat man warned Švejk solemnly. "Rheumatism here doesn't mean more than a chilblain. I'm anemic. I've lost half my stomach and 5 of my ribs, but no one believes me. We even had a fellow here who was deaf and dumb. For a fortnight, they wrapped him up every half an hour in a cold, wet sheet, and every day they gave him an enema and pumped his stomach. All the nurses thought he'd won through and would go home when the doctor prescribed him an emetic. It would have torn him in half, and so he lost courage. 'I can't go on being deaf and dumb,' he said. 'My speech and hearing have returned.' All the patients urged him not to ruin himself, but he insisted that he could hear and speak just like other people. And he reported this effect at the doctor's visit next morning. 'He kept it up for quite a long time,' remarked the man who was pretending to have one leg 4 inches shorter than the other. 'Not like the chap who shammed a stroke. All they had to do was to give him 3 doses of quinine, 1 enema, and a day's fasting.' He confessed, and by the time they started pumping out his stomach, there wasn't a trace left of his stroke. The chap who held out longest of all was the one who had been bitten by a mad dog. He bit and howled. It's true he could do it splendidly, but he just couldn't manage foam at the mouth. We did our best to help him. Several times, we tickled him for a whole hour before the doctor's visit until he had convulsions and got blue all over, but the foam wouldn't come, and didn't in fact come at all. It was really terrifying. When he gave in one morning at the doctor's visit, we were quite sorry for him. He stood by his bed, erect as a candle, saluted and said, 'Humbly report, sir, the dog I was bitten by may not have been mad after all.' The doctor gave him such a queer look that he began to tremble all over and went on, 'Humbly report, sir, I wasn't bitten by a dog at all. It was I who bit myself in the arm.' After that confession, they put him under investigation for self-mutilation on the charge that he had tried to bite off his arm to get out of the going to the front. All those kinds of illnesses where you have to foam at the mouth are difficult to sham," said the fat malingerer. "Take, for instance, epilepsy. We had an epileptic here who always used to tell us that, well, 1 fit wasn't enough, and so he put on some 10 a day. He writhed in convulsions, clenched his fists, rolled his eyes wildly, flung himself about on the floor, stuck out his tongue. In short, I can tell you, it was magnificent first-class epilepsy, the genuine thing. But suddenly, he got boils. 2 on the neck and 2 on the back. And it was all over with his writhing and flinging himself about on the floor when he couldn't move his head and wasn't able either to sit or lie down. He got fever, and in delirium, he let out everything at the doctor's visit. He gave us a lot of trouble over his boils because he had to lie here with them another 3 days and got another diet. Coffee and rolls in the morning, soup, dumplings and gravy for lunch, and porridge or soup in the evening. And with our hungry, pumped out stomachs and strict diet, we had to watch this fellow bowling the food, smacking his lips, panting and belching with repletion. In this way, he broke down another 3 who confessed as well. They had been suffering from heart disease. The best thing to sham, said one of the malingerers, is insanity. There are 2 of our teachers lying in the ward next door, and one of them shrieks out incessantly day and night, 'Giordano Bruno's steak is still smoldering. reopen the trial of Galileo. And the other one barks, first 3 times slowly. Wow, wow, wow. Then 5 times quickly in succession. Wow, 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 wow. And then once more slowly, and so it goes on without a break. They've managed to keep it up for over 3 weeks now. Or originally, I wanted to be insane too, have religious mania and preach about papal infallibility. But in the end, I fixed myself up with cancer of the stomach from a barber in Malastrana for 15 crowns. I know a chimney sweep in Břevnov, remarked another patient. For 10 crowns, he'll give you such a fever that you'll jump out of the window. That's nothing, said another. In Vershovice, there's a midwife who for 20 crowns will dislocate your leg so well that you'll be a cripple until your death. I had my leg dislocated for 10 crowns, came a voice from the row of beds by the window. For 10 crowns and 3 glasses of beer. My illness has cost me more than 200 already, announced his neighbor, a dried up stick. You tell me any poison I haven't taken. You won't find it. I've breathed in mercury fumes. I've chewed arsenic. I've smoked opium. I've drunk tincture of opium. I've sprinkled morphine on bread. I've swallowed strychnine. I've drunk a solution of phosphorus in carbon sulfate, as well as picric acid. I've destroyed my liver, my lungs, my kidneys, my gallbladder, my brain, my heart, and my intestines. No one knows what kind of illness I have. The best thing to do, explained somebody from the door, is to inject paraffin under the skin of your arm. My cousin was so fortunate as to have his arm cut off under the elbow, and today he has no trouble for the rest of the war. Thank you very much. And the next reader who will continue is Hořejš. So bye and enjoy.
So you see, said Švejk, everyone has to go through all that for his imperial majesty, even stomach pumping and enemas. When I served years ago in my regiment, it was even worse. In those days, they used to truss the patient and throw him into a hole to recuperate him. There weren't any bunks like there are here, or spittoons either. Just a bare plank bed, and the patients lay on it. Once one had a genuine typhus, and the other next to him had smallpox. Both were trussed, and the regimental doctor kicked them out. And my text got mangled here, and when both these soldiers died, it came up in Parliament and was in the newspapers. They immediately forbade us to read those newspapers and searched our boxes in case we had them. And as I always have bad luck, I was the only one in the whole regiment they found them on. So I was taken off on regimental report, and our colonel, who was a bloody half-wit, God help him, started to roar at me to stand straight and to tell him who it was who wrote that in the newspapers, or he'd break my jaw wide open and have me locked up till I was black in the face. Then came the regimental doctor, brandishing his fist under my nose and shouting in German, "You dirty hound, you lousy scab, you miserable turd, you socialist sod." I looked them all squarely in the eyes without blinking and kept quiet. My right hand at the peak of my cap and my left on the seam of my trousers. They ran around me like dogs and yapped at me, but I did nothing. I kept mum, saluted, left hand on the seam of my trousers. When they had been raging like this for about half an hour, the colonel rushed at me and roared. "Are you a half-wit, or aren't you?" "Humbly report, sir, I am a half-wit." "Very well, then. 21 days strict confinement for imbecility, 2 days a week fasting, and month confined to barracks, 48 hours in handcuffs, immediate arrest. Don't let him eat, truss him, show him that the monarchy doesn't need half-wits. We'll flog those newspapers out of your head, you bastard," the colonel decided after flying around for a long time. But while I was sitting in jug, miracles were happening in the barracks. Our colonel forbade our soldiers to read anything at all, even the Prague official news. In the canteen, they weren't even allowed to use the newspapers for wrapping up frankfurters or bits of cheese. From that time, all the soldiers started to read, and our regiment became the best educated. We read all the newspapers, and in every company they made up rhymes and songs against the colonel. And when anything happened in the regiment, you always find some public benefactor who sent in to the newspapers under the title "Maltreatment of the Troops." And they didn't stop at that. They wrote to the parliamentary deputies in Vienna, asking them to take up their case, and the deputies began to make interpellations, one after the other, saying that our colonel was a monster and such like. A minister sent a commission to us to investigate the case, and Franta Henschel from Hluboká got 2 years for being the chap who got onto the deputies in Vienna because of the knock across the jaw he got from the colonel on the drill ground. Later, when the commission went away, our colonel made us all fall in, the whole regiment, told us that a soldier is a soldier, that he must shut his mug and do his job, and if he doesn't like anything, that it's a breach of discipline. So you bloody bastards, thought that that commission would help you, said the colonel. A shit they helped you. And now every company will march past me and repeat aloud what I've said. And so we marched to where the colonel stood, one company after the other, eyes right, and our hands on our rifle slings, and shouted at him. And so we bloody bastards thought that that commission would help us. A shit they helped us. The colonel doubled up with laughter until the 11th Company marched up. They marched. They stamped. But when they reached the colonel, nothing at all. Not the faintest sound. The colonel got red as a turkey cock, marched the 11th Company back, and made them repeat the operation once more. They marched past in silence, and each rank after the other stared the colonel insolently in the eyes. "Stand at ease," said the colonel, and paced up and down the yard, lashing his boots with his riding crop and spitting about the place. Then he suddenly stopped and roared out, "Dismiss!" mounted his old crock, and away he was, out of the gate. We waited to see what would happen to the 11th Company, but still there was nothing. We waited one day, then another, and then a whole week, but still nothing happened. The colonel never appeared in the barracks at all, which gave great joy to the men, the NCOs, and the officers. After that, we got a new colonel, and it was rumored that the old one was in a sanatorium because he had written a letter in his own hand to His Imperial Majesty telling him that the 11th Company had mutinied. The time for the doctor's afternoon round approached. Dr. Greenstein went from bed to bed, followed by the medical orderly officer with his notebook. Matsuna, present. Enema and aspirin. Pokorny, present. Stomach pump and quinine. Kovacic, present. Enema and aspirin. Kochatko, present. Stomach pump and quinine. And so it went on, one after the other, mercilessly, mechanically, briskly. Švejk, present. Dr. Greenstein looked at the new acquisition. What's the matter with you? Humbly report, I've got rheumatism. In the course of his practice, Dr. Greenstein had grown accustomed to be gently ironical, which was much more effective than shouting. Rheumatism, he said to Švejk. And you've got a jolly serious illness. It's really a coincidence getting rheumatism just at a time when there is a world war. Oh, and you've got to go to the front. I think you must be awfully sorry. Humbly report, sir, I am awfully sorry. Well, there you are, you see, he is awfully sorry. It's really awfully nice of you that with your rheumatism you've not forgotten us, just at this particular moment. In peacetime, a poor chap like him runs about like a young goat, but as soon as war breaks out, he immediately gets rheumatism, and suddenly his knees don't work. Your knees hurt, I suppose? Humbly report they do, sir. And you can't sleep a wink the whole night, can you? Rheumatism's very dangerous, painful, and grave illness. We've already had good experience with rheumatics here. Strict diet and other treatment of ours have proved very effective. Here you'll be fit quicker than in Pieszczany Spa, and you'll march to the front like greased lightning. Turning to the hospital orderly, he said, write this down, Švejk. Strict diet, stomach pump twice a day, enema once a day, and we'll see how it goes after that. For the time being, take him to the consulting room, pump his stomach, and then when he comes to, give him an enema, but a real good one until he screams blue murder and his rheumatism gets frightened and runs away. Then turning to all the beds, the doctor made a speech full of noble and rational moral maxims. Don't imagine that I'm just a bloody half-wit who swallows all your bull. Your tricks don't rattle me in the least. I know you're all malingerers, and you want to desert from the war, and I'll treat you as such. I've survived hundreds and hundreds of soldiers like you. Masses of people have lain in these beds here who had nothing wrong with them at all, except that they hadn't got a soldier's guts. While their comrades were fighting on the battlefield, they thought they'd lounge about in bed, get hospital rations, and wait until the war flew by. But they all found they made a bloody mistake. And all of you will find you've made a bloody mistake too. In 20 years' time, you'll still be screaming in your sleep when you dream of how you tried it on with me. Humbly report, sir, came a gentle voice from the bed at the window. I am well again. I noticed in the night that my asthma's gone. Your name? Kovacic. Humbly report. I have to have an enema. Good. You'll still get an enema for the road, Dr. Greenstein decided, so that you don't complain that we didn't give you treatment here. Now all the patients whose names I've read out fall in and follow the orderly so that each can get what's due to him. And each one got a handsome dose of what they had been prescribed. And if any of them tried to work on those who were executing the orders by means of prayers or threats that they might too once join the medical corps, and the executioners might fall into their hands, Švejk, at least, bore himself with steadfastness. Don't spare me, he invited the myrmidon who was giving him the enema. Remember your oath. Even if it was your father or your own brother who was lying here, give him an enema without batting an eyelid. Try hard to think that Austria rests on these enemas, and victory is ours. The next day, on his round, Dr. Grünstein asked Švejk, or Švejk, how he was enjoying being in the military hospital. Švejk answered that it was a fair and high-minded institution. In reward, he received the same as the day before, plus aspirin and 3 quinine powders, which they dissolved into water so that he should drink them at once. And not even Socrates drank his hemlock bowl with such composure as did Švejk his quinine. When Dr. Grünstein was trying out on him all his various degrees of torture. When they wrapped Švejk up in a wet sheet in the presence of the doctor, his answer to the question how he liked it now was, "Humbly report, sir, it's like being in a swimming pool at the seaside, or at the seaside." Have you still got rheumatism? Humbly report, sir, it doesn't seem to want to get better. Švejk was subjected to new tortures. And now, from Prague, we are joined by actor and musician Ronald Prokeš.
At the time, the widow of the infantry general, Baroness von Botzenheim, took great pains to find that soldier about whom Bohemia had recently published a report that, crippled as he was, he had had himself pushed in a bath chair shouting, "To Belgrade!" which patriotic pronouncement induced the editorial staff of Bohemia to invite their readers to organize collections in aid of the loyal and heroic cripple. Finally, after inquiries at police headquarters, it was ascertained that the man in question was Švejk, and after that, it was easy to make search for him. Baroness von Botzenheim went to the Hradčany, taking with her her lady companion and her footman with a hamper. The poor Baroness had no idea what it meant for someone to be lying in the hospital of the garrison jail. Her visiting card opened the prison door for her. In the office, they were awfully nice, and in 5 minutes, she learned that the good soldier Švejk, whom she was looking for, lay in the third hut, bed number 17. She was accompanied by Dr. Grunstein himself, who was quite flabbergasted by it. Švejk was just sitting up in bed after the usual daily procedure prescribed by Dr. Grunstein, surrounded by a group of emaciated and starved malingerers who had not yet given up and were stubbornly struggling with Dr. Grunstein on the battlefield of strict diet. Anyone who had listened to them would have had the impression that he was in the company of epicures in a school of cordon bleu cuisine or a course for gourmets. You can even eat ordinary suet cracklings if they are warm. A patient with inveterate stomach catarrh was just telling the others at this moment. As the suet boils, you squeeze the cracklings dry, add salt and pepper, and I can tell you that goose cracklings are not in the same class. "You leave goose cracklings alone," said a man with cancer of the stomach. "There's nothing to touch them. What are pork cracklings in comparison? Of course, you must fry them until they're golden brown like the Jews do. They take a fat goose, draw the fat off with the skin, and fry it." "You know, you're quite wrong as far as pork cracklings are concerned," Švejk's neighbor put in. "Of course, I'm talking about cracklings of homemade fat, what they call homemade cracklings. They're not brown and they're not yellow. They must be something between the two shades. These kinds of cracklings mustn't either be too soft or too hard. And they mustn't be crunchy or they're overcooked. They must melt on the tongue and you mustn't feel the fat dripping off your chin." "Which of you have eaten horse cracklings?" chimed in a new voice. But there was no answer because at the moment the medical orderly ran in. "Everybody in bed. The Archduchess is coming here. Don't anyone dare show his dirty legs outside the bed." And not even the Archduchess could have entered the ward with such dignity as did Baroness von Botzenheim. After her, the whole suite poured in, including even the quartermaster sergeant major of the hospital, who saw in all this the mysterious hand of accounts control, which was going to tear him away from his fat-feeding trough at the base and deliver him to the tender mercies of the shrapnel somewhere under the barbed wire posts. He was pale, but Dr. Grunstein was even paler. Before his eyes, there danced the old Baroness's small visiting card with her title, Widow of a General, and everything which could be associated with it, like connections, protection, complaints, transfer to the front, and other frightful things. "Here you have Švejk," he said, endeavoring to preserve an artificial composure and leading the Baroness von Botzenheim to Švejk's bed. "He behaves with great patience." Baroness von Botzenheim sat down on the chair, prepared for her at Švejk's bed, and said, "Czech soldier, good soldier, cripple. Soldier is brave soldier. I love very much Czech Austrian." At that, she stroked Švejk on his unshaven cheeks and went on, "I read everything in the newspapers I bring you, yum yum. something to bite, to smoke, to suck. Czech soldier, good soldier, Johann, come here. Her footman, whose bristly side whiskers recalled the notorious killer Babinski, dragged a voluminous hamper to the bed, while the old Baroness's companion, a tall lady with a tearful face, sat down on Švejk's bed and smoothed out his straw pillow under his back with the fixed idea that this was what ought to be done for sick heroes. In the meantime, the Baroness drew presents out of the hamper. A dozen roast chickens wrapped up in pink silk paper and tied with a yellow and black silk ribbon, 2 bottles of war liqueur with the label Gott strafe England. On the back of the label was a picture of Franz Josef and Wilhelm, clasping hands, as though they were going to play the nursery game. Bunny sat alone in his hole. Poor little Bunny, what's wrong with you that you can't hop? Then she took out of the hamper 3 bottles of wine for the convalescent and 2 boxes of cigarettes. She set out everything elegantly on an empty bed next to Švejk's, where she also put a beautifully bound book, Stories from the Life of Our Monarch, which had been written by the present meritorious chief editor of our official Czechoslovak Republic, who doted on old Franz. Packets of chocolate with the same inscription, Gott strafe England, and again, with pictures of the Austrian and German emperors, found their way to the bed. On the chocolate, they were no longer clasping hands. Each was acting on his own and turning his back to the other. There was a beautiful toothbrush with 2 rows of bristles and the inscription Viribus Unitis, so that anyone who cleaned his teeth should remember Austria. An elegant and extremely useful gift for the front and the trenches was a manicure set. On the case was a picture showing shrapnel bursting and a man in a steel helmet rushing forward with fixed bayonet. And underneath it was written in German, "For God, Emperor, and Fatherland." There was a tin of biscuits without a picture on it, but with a verse in German instead, together with a Czech translation on the back. Austria, thou noble house, thy banners wide unfurl, thy flag shall flutter proud and high. Austria shall never die. The last gift was a white hyacinth in a flower pot. When all of this lay unpacked on the bed, the Baroness von Botzenheim could not restrain her tears for emotion. Several famished malingerers felt their mouths water. The Baroness's companion propped up the seated Švejk and wept too. There was a silence of the grave, which was suddenly broken by Švejk, who said with his hands clasped in prayer, "Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom..." No, pardon me, your ladyship, this is not right. I mean to say, "O God, our Father in heaven, which bless for us these gifts that we may enjoy them thanks to thy goodness. Amen." After these words, he took a chicken from the bed and started to devour it under the horrified gaze of Dr. Grunstein. "How he enjoys it, poor soldier," the old Baroness whispered enthusiastically to Dr. Grunstein. "He's certainly well again and can go to the battlefield. I'm really very glad that my gifts stand him in such good stead." Then she walked from bed to bed, distributing cigarettes and chocolate creams. When she came back again to Švejk after her promenade, she stroked his hair and said in German, "God protect you all," and went out of the door with her whole escort. And now I would like to hand the floor over to Richard Fidler in Australia, I believe.
Thank you, Ronald. Before Dr. Grunstein could return from below, where he'd gone to see the Baroness out, Švejk had distributed the chickens. They were bolted by the patients so quickly that Dr. Grunstein found only a heap of bones gnawed cleanly, as though the chickens had fallen alive into a nest of vultures and the sun had been beating down on their gnawed bones for several months. The war liqueur and the 3 bottles of wine had also disappeared. The packets of chocolate and the box of biscuits were likewise lost in the patients' stomachs. Someone had even drunk up the bottle of nail polish, which was in the manicure set, and eaten the toothpaste, which had been enclosed with the toothbrush. When Dr. Grunstein returned, He resumed his belligerent pose and delivered a long speech. A stone fell from his heart now that the visitors had gone. The pile of gnawed bones confirmed his belief that they were all incorrigible. Men, he burst out, if you'd had a little sense, you'd have left it all untouched and said to yourselves, if we eat it all up, then the doctor won't believe that we're very ill. Now you've yourselves provided me with proof that you don't appreciate my kindness. I pump your stomachs. I give you enemas. I try to keep you on a strict diet. And you go and stuff up your stomachs again. Do you want to get stomach catarrh? You're making a great mistake. Before your stomach tries to digest all this, I'll clean it out for you so thoroughly you'll remember it to your dying day and tell your children how you once gobbled up chickens and gorged yourself on various other delicacies, and how they didn't stay in your stomach 15 minutes because they pumped it out while it was all still warm. And now, fall in all of you, one after the other, so that you don't forget that I'm not a bloody fool like you are, but a little bit cleverer than the whole lot of you altogether. In addition, I want to inform you that tomorrow I'm going to send a commission to you because you've been lazing around here far too long. And there's nothing wrong with any of you. If in those 5 minutes you could pick it and stuff your stomachs up so chock full as you did just now. 1, 2, 3, march! When it was Švejk's turn, Dr. Grunstein looked at him, and a memory of the mysterious visit of the day prompted him to ask, "You know Her Excellency?" "She's my stepmother," Švejk answered calmly. "In tender years she abandoned me, and now she's found me again." And Dr. Grunstein said tersely, "Afterwards, give Švejk an extra enema." In the evening, melancholy reigned among the bunks. A few hours earlier, all of them had had in their stomachs various good and tasty things, and now they only had weak tea and a slice of bread. From the window could be heard the voice of number 21. "Do you know, chaps, I prefer fried chicken to roast." Somebody growled, "Give him the blanket treatment." But they were all so weak after the unsuccessful banquet that no one stirred. Dr. Grunstein was as good as his word. In the morning there came several military doctors from the famous commission. They went solemnly past the rows of beds and said nothing else but, "Put out your tongue." Švejk put his tongue out so far that his face made an idiotic grimace and his eyes screwed up. "I'll report, sir, I don't have a longer tongue than that." And an interesting discussion arose between Švejk and the commission. Švejk asserted that he had made this observation in case they might think he was trying to hide his tongue from them. The members of the commission, however, were remarkably divided in their conclusions about Švejk. Half of them insisted that Švejk was a half-wit, while the other half insisted he was a scoundrel who was trying to make fun of the war. "It'll be a bloody miracle," roared the chairman of the commission at Švejk, "if we don't get the better of you." Švejk looked at the whole commission with the godlike composure of an innocent child. The senior staff doctor came up close to Švejk. "I'd like to know, you swine, what you're thinking about now." "Humbly report, sir, I don't think at all." "Himmeldonnerwetter!" bawled one of the members of the commission, rattling his saber. "So he doesn't think at all? Why, in God's name, don't you think, you Siamese elephant?" "Humbly report, I don't think, because that's forbidden for soldiers on duty. When I was in the 91st Regiment some years ago, our captain always used to say, a soldier mustn't think for himself. His superiors do it for him. As soon as a soldier begins to think, he's no longer a soldier, but a dirty, lousy civilian. Thinking doesn't get you anywhere." "Shut your mug," the chairman of the commission interrupted Švejk in fury. "We all know about you already. The swine thinks he'll be taken for a genuine idiot. You're not an idiot at all, Švejk. You're cunning. You're foxy. You're a scoundrel. You're a hooligan. You're a lousy bastard. Do you understand? Humbly reports, sir, I understand. I've already told you to shut your mug. Did you hear? Humbly reports, sir, I heard that I must shut my mug. Himmel, Herrgott, then shut it. When I've given you orders, you know very well you must stop talking rot. Humbly reports, sir, I know well I must stop talking rot. The military gentleman exchanged glances and called the sergeant major. Take this man to the office, said the senior staff doctor, pointing to Švejk, and wait for the announcement and report. At the garrison, they'll knock all this drivel out of his head. The fellow's as fit as a fiddle. He's only shamming, and into the bargain he talks rot and tries to make fun of his superiors. He thinks they're only here for his amusement, and that the whole war's a joke, a laughing matter. At the garrison, Švejk, they'll soon show you that war is no picnic. Švejk went off with the sergeant major to the office, and on the way through the courtyard, hummed to himself. I always thought that war was fun, a week or two, and home I'd run. And while in the office, the duty officer was bellowing at Švejk that bastards like him ought to be shot. In the wards upstairs, the commission was making short shrift with the malingerers. Of 70 patients, only 2 got through. One had had a leg torn off by a shell, and the other suffered from genuine bone decay. And these 2 were the only ones who did not hear the word tauglich. All the others, including even the 3 dying of consumption, were certified fit for service at the front. Whereupon the senior staff doctor did not deny himself the opportunity of making a speech. His speech was interlarded with the most variegated oaths and was brief in content. They were all swine and dung, and only if they were to fight valiantly for his imperial majesty would they be fit to return to human society, and after the war be forgiven for having tried to get out of military service and been malingerers. He himself, however, didn't believe that this would happen and thought the gallows were in store for all of them. A youngish army doctor, whose soul was still pure and uncorrupted, asked the senior staff doctor if he might say a few words too. His speech distinguished itself from that of his superior by its optimism and naivety. He spoke in German. He dwelt long on the fact that each of them who was leaving the hospital to join their regiments at the front must be conqueror and knight. He was convinced they would be skillful in handling their weapons on the battlefield and honorable in all their dealings in war and in private life. They would be unconquerable heroes, mindful of the glory of Radetzky and Prince Eugene of Savoy. With their blood, they would fertilize the vast fields of glory of the monarchy and victoriously accomplish the task to which history had predestined them. With fearless courage, despising their lives, they would charge forward under the bullet-ridden ensigns of their regiments towards new glories and new victories. Later in the corridor, the senior staff doctor said to this naive man, "My dear colleague, I can assure you it's all a complete waste of time. Why, not even Radetzky or your Prince Eugene of Savoy could make soldiers out of bastards like them. Whether you speak to them like an angel or a devil, it all comes to the same thing. They're a gang of crooks." Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, and thanks so much to our whole team from the last section.
Za císaře pana a jeho rodinu, za císaře pana a jeho rodinu museli jsme vybojovat Hercegovinu.